afternoon, and thank you for coming to this session. We are looking forward with some level of tentativeness because this is really work done over 5 days to share with you some of the lessons that came through from our white paper. A lot of it really was also just trying to dialogue and understand each other methodologically in order to sort of put out some points to share with you. So we have the white paper ready, but it is not edited and cleaned up. So we will release the white paper on the CARE website and on our Facebook page in about a week. So what we will do today is just share some of the key lessons from the white paper. And the way we will do it is I will sort of set up the broader picture, and then Sue will come on board and share her perspective from the standpoint of an activist, the way in which we see the challenges in academic activist collaborations. Then I will bring it back and ground it within the context of the academe and ask the same question from an academic standpoint, and then hopefully find some hopes and aspirations for the future. Because, the picture that we will start with is a fairly bleak picture. But we want to, both of us, I think, are hopeful, optimistic people. So we want to then wrap up with what then are sort of some of the imaginaries for hope. Now, when we started talking about how best to frame this conversation, we thought that, the best way to do it would be to talk about the work of academics and activists in the context of the struggles of the oppressed. So that really becomes the anchor through which we are locating this conversation in terms of how then can we think of academia and the nature of activism as it concerns with the struggles of the oppressed. So we will sort of begin with the global picture and look at the global challenges, which are also, of course, local. So as we present the picture and look at some of the global trends, you'll be able to relate these to the context of New Zealand and see how they play out. Then we will talk about why, think through academic activist linkages, and then talk about sort of the activist and then academic strategies. So, if you think about the broad landscape of global challenges, of course, we talk about increasing inequality, unemployment, precarity of work, but we also wanted to highlight issues such as land grab and the global dispossession of indigenous communities, which continues to be an ongoing struggle across the globe, and often with the logic of neoliberal development and poverty alleviation. So the irony in all of this, of course, is that the solutions to problems of poverty and disenfranchisement are often forms of privatization, commoditization, and displacement from spaces of livelihood. Along with this, then, we want to attend to the environmental risks, and particularly the ways in which these risks are disproportionately borne out by the poor and their livelihoods. So we also interrogate the middle class, environmentally conscious, Green Party kind of rhetoric of we will save the environment by eating healthy and eating green, which at the same time obfuscates the kinds of politics of power and inequality that go into sites of food production and displacement from sites of food production. So climate change is for us a class issue. It is an issue of dispossession, but it is also an issue of the ways in which notions of sustainability, greenness are used as branding campaigns for global capital. So within that backdrop, then we see some big picture questions in terms of the organizing of power. So with interpenetrating global boundaries, we see the consolidation of power in the hands of financial capital, accompanied by expert decision-making processes, where experts continue to carry out decisions that are then to be translated or to be carried on to communities that are dispossessed. Here, we also want to point out that this expert-driven decision-making goes hand in hand with the engagement industry. So you see increasing numbers of indigenous engagement, rural engagement, that sort of are constructed within this expertise-driven framework, so that engagement becomes the buzzword for having the token indigenous person, the token poor person at the table as these displacements are carried out. So along with this, we see something which we were just talking about in terms of how powerful it is, which is erasure of democratic structures and spaces for participation. So here's the irony. On one hand, there is a proliferation of engagement. Everyone is doing civic engagement, community engagement, participatory engagement, and that has become itself a funding structure. And at the same time, actual democratic spaces of participation, articulation, and contestation are systematically being erased. So all of this we frame within the context of the increasing concentration of power and wealth in the hands of transnational elite and the ways in which then elites shape these communicative spaces. I will now, sort of setting this up, so open up the space for you to talk about how you locate academic activist struggles within this broader framework.
Kia ora Mohan and kia ora koutou. Some of you are now becoming familiar, but some of you are probably with us for the first time this week. But first of all, thank you so much, Mohan and Kia and Massey University, for making me so welcome, as I think the first ever activist in residence in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we've done quite a lot of media in the last 24 hours. Mohan has painted a really, I think, very accurate and complete global picture, and I think already we can see how much Aotearoa New Zealand fits into that picture. When I started thinking how a response from the activist side and from this country, I went back into my time when I was first working in an activist organisation that was also trying to collaborate with academics in the academic world, but really struggling with it, and looking back to see, okay, if I think back to then rather than all the experience I've had since, what were our struggles in those first times? Because I thought it might be quite interesting. So I looked at my 16 years in the Auckland Unemployed Workers' Rights Centre that I did talk about the other day in the 1980s and 1990s, where we started as just a ragged, rugged group of unemployed people and beneficiaries and our families, working on a political kaupapa of jobs and a living wage for all, but also providing individual advocacy services for people in that situation, and gradually grew into a much bigger complex of organisations, not only providing a lot of services for people on the ground, but also doing a lot of policy work, research and development, putting up alternatives and solutions. And as we tried more and more to work with academics, we remained very wary of the academy. And some of the reasons for that were our fear that our efforts in research and writing would be taken over by the academics and used by them, because they had far more access to money, to time and to mana than we did. There were many social work students and other students from other disciplines placed within our groups as we became more well known, but we also at times felt quite resentful at the way the academy placed students with us for supervision, support, teaching, mentoring, but we never had any money for that. I mean, we were just expected to do it. A third sense of weariness was around, we just always felt we were second class. And for those of us, I had the privilege of a university education, but some of our people didn't, of course. And for them it was even worse, a sort of sense of contempt and distaste, because we weren't really researchers, we weren't really policy people that knew anything about policy. We were just, how real that was, I don't know, but that's certainly what we felt. And for those without education, it was even worse. And often enough, and I think this is probably across the world and across our communities here, people in disenfranchised communities and in community-based groups and unions often feel that they're the objects of research, that there's not a genuine reciprocity. And I know there's been heaps of work done in that area, but I think that is still the case in my experience. So some of the lessons from those years that we took into practice were the importance, as we gradually did more and more with the academic world, culminating, I think, our peak experience, and I really must pay respect to Massey University, and it's almost a full circle here, that in the late 1990s, Professor Mike O'Brien from Social Practice, Social Work, Social Policy at Massey collaborated with the Auckland Unemployed Workers' Rights Centre, and together we staged two annual conferences to which we invited over 200 people came to each in the areas of welfare and poverty, both from the activist and academic world. Albany Massey hosted it, so we had it at the university. We published the proceedings from each. People from both worlds gave contributions which were written up and published. And we also invited the academics to join us on demonstrations straight after the conferences. So it was, I think, a beautiful example of what can happen when there is that more reciprocal, active, productive relationship, which stimulated a whole lot of other activity and thinking as well. So in reaching that more productive kind of relationship, I think some of the things that we held dear were the importance of building long-term relationships of trust between academics and activists. It's not something that happens quickly. It needs to be face-to-face. It needs to be in-depth. There needs to be a sense that those academics we work with are truly with us in some way. I mean, they don't have to be with us. They don't have to be out on the streets with us, but that they do genuinely support the kaupapa and don't look down on us. And the usefulness of actually engaging in activity together, whether it's organising a conference or out on the street or whatever. It's not just theoretical. It's very real. I think there can be no generalisation about work with the Academy. Of course, the Academy is as diverse as the communities it might work with. So for people outside the Academy, understanding the Academy itself is quite a mission, especially for those that have had nothing to do with it, and how diverse disciplines are, ways of thinking. Universities themselves are very different, and it's quite hard from outside to understand that. So this building of trust and understanding has to go both ways. But within that, I think for our group back then, the most important thing was that we always retained our sense of mana, our sense of belief in and stuck to our own kaupapa no matter what. And that's the way you resist co-option within collaboration. So for groups working with the Academy, I'd always think that is the most important thing of all, to remember the kaupapa, and stand by it and not allow it to be eroded. I mean, this applies to funding, relationships with government and everything else, but also with the Academy. Moving it right along. So after those years, well, my proofing didn't happen here, I think. We were doing this in a very big rush. I had a media interview in the middle of this. As people know, in 1999 I went to Parliament, so I had 10 years seeing everything from the other way round. I helped set up a new group called Auckland Action Against Poverty in 2010, did a PhD through those years, had a brief year as a lecturer, full-time lecturer at Unitec, which brought me back into some of the realities of the academic world that many of you would know very well. And then in 2014, at the end of that year, I left Unitec, a big risk, like losing all that money, all that security, to be part of a project to set up a new left think tank that came out of the research I did for my PhD. And that was hugely risky and proved to be even riskier than I imagined. But because my thesis was around the question of why we don't have a left think tank in Aotearoa and what would it take to set one up, especially one that worked well between the activist and academic worlds, I was going right into the zone of our Mohans and my topic today for 3 years in my study. And I came to realise again how perilous that zone is, because in the middle of last year, in mid-2017, despite huge effort by a number of people, and in the end we had about 800 people on our contact list by the time I left. A number of us left Ezra in the middle of last year. There is a group remaining and that think tank continues, but a number of us that were part of the project are no longer with it. So I don't want to talk in any detail about any of that experience, but I think there are lessons from that and lessons from these past years that I'm reflecting on today. And again, I'd like to thank the Kia and Mohan for giving me this opportunity to reflect at a bit of a distance, because it's been a very hard time both for both the academics and activists that were involved in that project to come to terms with our hope to build this new left think tank, and then to see that perhaps it didn't come to the fruition we would have hoped for, although it still continues, and I wish the people well that are still working there. So I'm not going to talk about any of the details of that, but just in this last piece, a few reflections built not only on the experience of trying to build a left think tank that crosses the activist and academic worlds, but also from all the other places that I've been. Just a few of the key things that I think we need to acknowledge when we work together, or try and work together. The first is around language and communication, and I think everything I'm saying here will probably be, from what I've seen, picked up by Mohan as well in a slightly different way, and from his experience across 30 countries. I'm only talking about Aotearoa here. But the first thing that's so critical is acknowledgement and understanding of the gap between academic language and writing and the language of people in community-based and union organisations, whether they're tangata whenua or tauiwi or a mix, that the language is very different. And while academics can understand, of course you all know that, sorry I'm saying you, but some of you may not be academics, sorry. Academics know, think about language a lot, and I absolutely accept, having achieved a PhD, that we must use the discipline of the academic language and the discipline and rigour of it, which I really value. Like, we must use that language in our different disciplines. But at the same time, if academics are going to work with activists and groups at the grassroots, there needs to be more awareness of actually how you translate that, especially if your research is not going to sit just within the electronic database or the library. It's not going to just sit in academic journals. But if it's research that is aimed into the activist and real world, that it needs to be disseminated and used in ways that the people can understand. And this sounds simple, but in my experience, it doesn't happen well. That some academics, really do not understand this. That's why I'm reiterating the point. And that some writing at least, if we want to have genuine and deep theoretical debates and genuine and deep sharings of praxis, of putting theory into practice, both of those things need to happen in language. The activist world can't engage the debate properly in an equal way unless the language we share is a common language. So that's my first point. The second one that I've learnt from these recent years is about relationships, and again, for anyone from the community sector or student politics or anywhere, political parties, anywhere where you try to build groups and take action, the importance of having mutual respect and trust between humans. Again, this sounds really simple, but in practice, and people on the left are really often bad at this, we actually end up having really poor relationships with each other, abusive relationships, sectarianism, problems between people of faith and people without faith, problem between different parts of the left or different left organisations within our parties, within our groups. This is all part of our experience, and it's a reality, and I've been part of all those whawhai, all those fights. But at the same time, if we want to build a group together that transcends those boundaries, which is what is the only way we're going to succeed in changing this country, we have to pay much more attention, especially us Pākehā Māori have far deeper consciousness of this than we do often, because we have such an individualistic background. But Pākehā particularly really need to pay attention and learn from Māori world that above all we have to genuinely respect each other and build relationships that last, otherwise we cannot work together and organisations will fall apart, and academic collaborations will fall apart and do if relationships aren't put at the centre. The third point, there's a lot more detail about this in the paper, but the third point is around accountability and power. That wariness or caution I talked about from the Unemployed Rights Centre history remains with many of the people I work with in the activist world in an ongoing way, because groups and people continue to feel abused and exploited by research projects and universities and academics. And oh no, I better not give too much, this is being recorded. But I guess one way is, this research project comes to South Auckland where lots of people live in poverty, and they put on a free lunch for the community, and people come along and they are researched, and big academic writing comes out of this meeting or lunch or series of lunches. But what do the people of that district ever get back from it? That's just a very simple example, but that sort of thing happens over and over again. Or being interviewed and having your words end up in somebody's thesis or research project or paper where what you said is totally mangled and misrepresented. These are small examples, there can be much bigger ones. But academics who want to work collaboratively and well with activists have to have a very deep insight into the power they hold and the understanding that in this country most community-based organisations and unions are totally under-resourced, are facing a struggle against powers much greater than us. We're fragile, broken, fragmented, even though the universities are full of problems around security and wages and conditions and a whole lot of other things. The university is still a much more protected and secure place than it is out in some community group fighting poverty in South Auckland. And for academics to truly understand that and not just come in and use and abuse those groups for their own purposes, I think sounds really basic, but it needs to be said. The next thing is context and understanding for people that haven't been used, and I guess maybe I am thinking of people like Mohan and others that come from overseas, and I really welcome this input of new knowledge and experience to our country, but the importance of understanding the role of the treaty and the relation that we are a colonised country and still colonised, we're not post-colonised. The importance of trying to get to grips with what it means to be non-Māori in this land, but to work in recognition of te treaty and tino rangatiratanga and a whole range of other things that go behind that. But also the importance of understanding our context for funding and resourcing of community-based organisations, which is very different, for example, from America, where philanthropic trusts can often be quite progressive and fund quite progressive activities of all sorts on the ground, or from the EU, where there's massive anti-poverty funding that goes across nations, or from many countries that we used to call developing countries, where overseas aid and NGO money and all sorts of money flows from some sources, and of course much of that's contaminated, but there is still access to funds that there is very little access, apart in some cases for some Indigenous organisations, but for organisations working only with Pākehā or across everybody, there's no funding like that. So we are a very under-resourced place. So for academics to understand the reality of that and what it means to feel on the other side of that divide is really important. The final point I wanted to make here was about, and it's related, is the valuing of activist labour. Understanding we from an activist point of view are often working for nothing or for very little or very low wages or very part-time wages, but doing a lot more work than we're paid for. And for academics to understand that work, A, is valuable, and even though it's not worth dollars, it's valuable. Again, I've met some who just have no concept of that and of what's behind that. So putting real value beyond dollars, but actually recognise we also need dollars, is a key part of growing a better relationship. And just finally, in terms of sources of hope and going forward, I really share Mohan's hopes that care coming here and its years of experience of working across many different places will bring new insights and new methodologies and methods that will help change this rather negative. I fear I may have painted a bit of a negative picture, but will actually bring new ideas, and already just from 1 week I can see that new ideas and methodologies are with care. And I'm really looking forward to being part of groups or projects, or even just of theorising and thinking around how this works and can work here in a very different context. And I think not just CARE, but any academic or any group that comes in here with these new ideas, we should welcome with open arms, because we are an isolated country in the south of the planet. And the second thing, because, well, I've only alluded to it, some of us have been through a very rough journey in this area over the last few years, and it's been very difficult, and this is the first time I've talked about it publicly at all. I think when the time finally comes that all of us involved can analyse and learn together about the experiences we've been through, it will actually help strengthen the future of activist academic collaboration. Kia ora.
Thanks, Sue. I will just build on that conversation, starting with a precursor that, what I'll share is from the work of care in many other contexts. So we'll need to contextualize some of the lessons within the context of New Zealand, and also sharing that a lot of what I'm going to share is autocritique. So it's a critique of the self, of my role as an academic, situated in partnerships with activist organizations, as well as working with the poor. So I will begin with this idea that to think about academia and activism for me is to bring activism into academia. And that essentially means to question the methods, the ways of producing knowledge within academia that we take for granted. So when we think about this question of partnerships with the margins, the questions for me are, what does it mean to listen to the margins? And what does it mean for those at the margins to have a voice? And this ties in with many of the points that Sue made, particularly in terms of academics coming in historically and taking stories, extracting them to turn them into journal articles before giving back to the community or contributing to community. And this unfortunately seems to be a global phenomenon. In my work, I talk about this as academic tourism, or the chic radical activist, that comes in, and radicalism itself becomes a performance, often at the cost of the poor and the dispossessed. So you have academics making careers out of extracting these stories and performing a suited, booted kind of radicalism within academia, without challenging sort of the structures of academia, or without placing the bodies on the line in risk. I have to say, how often have I been disappointed working across many contexts that, you will have academics making all kinds of claims to queering academia and transforming academic spaces, but when rubber hits the road, when the heat is turned up, they're all gone, and there are all kinds of excuses about ambiguities and strategic essentialism and negotiating ambiguities. So I think a part of my critique of academia is precisely that radical performativity, which sort of actually in many ways supports the neoliberal status quo. Because to the extent that academia is turned into that kind of individualized performativity, it really takes away from transformative opportunities of challenging the broader structures that need to be challenged. So I will talk a little bit about the work of CARE that we do as a way to contextualize the challenges. So for us at CARE, we begin with the question that how do structural inequities get reproduced, or how does disenfranchisement get reproduced? And we argue that disenfranchisement is fundamentally communicative and it is symbolic. Hence, sort of in many of the work of CCA, it's also a critique of communist parties and central planning-based sort of structures that often think about producing change at the cost of erasing the voices of the margins. So this question about how do we create spaces of communicative equalities also turns to this idea that how do we create sites of listening where actually those that have historically been oppressed feel that they can have a voice in a meaningful way without their bodies being exploited. So through our work, one of the rules of thumb that we have developed at CARE as part of our collaborative projects is that we usually don't publish any of our work till communities and community advisory boards and community groups feel that the work is ready to be published. And usually that comes after communities feel that there has been an impact been made. Yeah. So it also fundamentally inverts or disrupts the idea of how we think about academic work. And that's why as a center, we are quite skeptical of someone coming in and saying, hey, we want to do a service learning project. Yeah, because service learning projects can be incredibly exploitative of the labor and the time that communities at the margins put in, only for students to earn a grade and for a teacher to have said, oh, we have done a service learning project. The same kind of logic, and this ties in with what you were saying, so that the same kind of logic works with research. So CARE sort of goes through a process of really vetting and working through academic partners to think through whom are we going to collaborate with the simple idea that, if you're looking for a 1 year or a 2 year production cycle, academia has sort of been turned into production cycles. If you're looking at 1 year, 2 year production cycles of the work, then perhaps we are not a good partner. Most of our projects take 5, 6 years into the work before we even start writing about it. So in this sense, this also raises interesting questions about what does it mean for junior academics, what does it mean for junior colleagues inhabiting academia, and what does it mean about sort of the metrics by which we are measured within academia. So with the framework of the culture-centered approach, there are sort of 3 broad questions that guide our work. So one is, how do we develop habits of learning to learn from below? And that means that, sort of coming into these conversations is also a way for decolonizing the methods that we have learned, or the languages we have learned. How often I have been amazed at sort of an expert coming into a community and saying, okay, we can, this is your point about context, I think, so that, okay, we can sort of gather some data out of the community, as if the community is some data, in order to develop an intervention or a solution to be given out and imposed on the community. So this notion of patient listening to an ethic of the other becomes a basis for really thinking through what does it mean to work toward another imagination. So, the kaupapa of CARE, right, is how do we transform structures through communication, culture, and community grounded in an ethic of listening. So just quickly, and I will just rush through this slide, here's a project that it's an ongoing project with women farmers in south of India. So if you know the onslaught of Monsanto and sort of the biotech industry and the erasure of women farmers, indigenous women farmers from places of livelihood, this project is about how do we create knowledge structures that actually disrupt the neoliberal transformation of agriculture. And that works through using community radio, where the women run a community radio station to tell the stories of seeds and to actually create transformative entry points through telling the story of seeds. This is also a good example because when academics want to come into this project, they often want to tell this story. So they want to do a few interviews, spend a couple of months, and then get a publication out of it. And we have had to really work hard to invert the logic to begin to ask this question, okay, if you're going to come on board, how are you going to contribute? How is your labor going to contribute to this work? So in this context, this indigenous radio station, Sangam Radio, really struggles with the funding. How do they actually sustain themselves economically? So it's an interesting question when academics come on board, that how do you then imagine funding structures within sort of the neoliberal organizing of the funding space in terms of supporting sites like these community radio projects. So I won't get into sort of the details of this, but in terms of what CARE does, we actually, a lot of the work we do is material, physical, like building hospitals or health clinics or clean drinking water systems, irrigation systems. But we also produce documentaries and run advocacy campaigns. Now, some of this then points to also the notion that when you actually start listening to the voices of the oppressed, it makes your position within the academe very uncomfortable. Yeah, so CARE has had to be in very uncomfortable situations with structures, particularly with specific kinds of projects. So we had a poverty project in Singapore, for instance, that came under various kinds of scrutiny because poverty is not a language. If you sort of imagine Singapore, and for most people that are not familiar with Singapore, you fly in and out of Changi Airport and it's your surreal imagination of the smart city of the future. So Singapore is not really interested in telling the story of poverty. So this project came under a lot of scrutiny through various structures because it was articulating a narrative of poverty. So I'm just bringing this up to say that when you actually commit to this idea of partnership anchored in the struggles of the oppressed, it's going to make one's academic position quite vulnerable and subject to scrutiny in that kind of a sense. So I'm going to go through some broad points and drawing on this. So in terms of when we think about the question of nature of local global oppression, power is intertwined to how this oppression is carried out, and academe is part of that production of power and how knowledge has been generated to carry out that production. So I think that is a critical point. So if you think about the neoliberal transformation of the globe, that is an academic transformation. It started with Chicago and the think tanks that were producing particular kinds of knowledge that were then legitimated to make these transformations possible. So academia is very much at the center of how this transformation is carried out. So when you ask the question of poverty, for instance, there are so many well-funded programs on poverty alleviation, yeah? And what they do is basically contribute to the neoliberal knowledge base about structural adjustments, about economic solutions that individualize poverty, that actually are then formulated into policy. So in that sense, the role of academe in struggles of the oppressed is critical in terms of intervening into sort of the neoliberal structures and ways of organizing power. So within that context, thinking through these conversations with Sue, I think one of the incredible questions is how do we negotiate power, recognizing that we as academics hold power. We as academics are situated within institutions which are the sites of disempowering, including having carried out various forms of colonization. If you look at histories of universities and academic institutions, so how do we start undoing those and participating in those struggles? I think, the conversations at Massey that we are having about being a Teterity-led university is a fascinating conversation because, the kinds of responses of of free speech, you see, there I give away my the free speech that you see demonstrate the notions of white privilege and how that plays out in colonizing logics. So I think in that sense, the journey for decolonizing the university as a site is a long journey, and we really have to constantly think about that in terms of academic activist linkages. We also have to think about where our work is co-optive and where is it transformative. I have found that often, the work that we do, say with poverty, a university might want to brand it so that it can be the social justice university. And then when the poor really start speaking up, they want to shut us down. Yeah, so that is the balance between co-option and transformation. So all of this actually really looks pretty seductive on pen and paper, because every university wants to contribute to the global conversation, wants to be the social justice university, the citizenship university. But it is actually when these ideas challenge sort of the neoliberal order, I think those are the points of interrogation. So in terms of hopes for transformation, I will just articulate a few ideas. One is the idea of power sharing, with humility. How do we share power, recognizing that we sit in positions of power? How do we share this power with activists and with the oppressed in ways that they find meaningful in terms of using this power as a tool, as a resource? Similarly, with the idea of resource sharing, Sue, you talked about community-based organizations being in an environment where there is very little money. This is, again, a part of a global conversation. So how then can academia be reorganized in terms of logics of power sharing? And we have had many different ideas. So we have, CARE has collaborated with projects where the community organization and the community runs the funding. And we go in as part of the collaborator to apply for the funding. But that also has its limits. And I want to also be critical about this whole idea of funding, because often when you start appealing to funders and running, whether you're a civil society organization or an academic, when you start depending on these funding cycles to carry out your work, that also turns you into a neoliberal structure in many ways, So that's why this question of critical reflexivity, I think, is really important, continually critiquing and interrogating the positions that we sit on and the ways in which those erased. So I have often been amazed at sort of how some of the most critical academics, saying most of very radical things, will go into a community and treat people in the community in the most disempowering ways. Yeah. So I think that is critical in terms of critical reflexivity as a method, in terms of thinking through. You talked about relationships, but in terms of how then we treat others, particularly in relationships of power, being aware of that power. So that brings me to this question of humility. How can we cultivate habits of humility in academia, where so often we are trained to be arrogant? Our PhDs are given to us so that we can be certain of certain things and certain methods. I was just coming back yesterday from seeing a colleague share a post, a link to a post about how academia is filled with grievance studies, and I was just thinking, so much of that comes from actually a place of power, and that place of power being really threatened because voices have started speaking out. So I think humility is about really cultivating habits to listen and to attend to the other that have historically been disenfranchised. So today, if you're feeling uncomfortable, it is perhaps because there are many other voices that are speaking up that challenge that position that you have occupied historically as a colonizer. So that then contributes to this conversation on politics of transformation. How do we commit to transforming the university, and knowing fully well that universities are neoliberal structures? Right, that even when a university commits to social justice, it has to talk about rankings and funding and being committed to those in order to sustain itself. So I think that dance is critical. So I will wrap up with that.
I'm not an academic, so you just have to ignore my ignorance. But a lot of what you were talking about seems to me is something that anthropology deals with. In the research, is that correct? Like how they interact with different groups of people? It's a sort of a way of taking all that stuff into account that you're talking about today, with respect and listening and the other and all that sort of thing. Would that be fair?
I would say that there are many disciplines that sort of engage with that question, all the way from anthropology to education to communication to geography. Yeah, you will see this across disciplines. But you also have to recognize that, say, anthropology as a discipline is historically colonial. So even when anthropologists went into communities wanting to listen, they went in working for the East India Company. They would listen so that they could colonize and oppress, There is also a history of that in terms of disciplines.
So how did this organisation, how did CARE get from... Is it based in Singapore, is that right?
No, it's based in Massey now.
Yes, but how did it get from where it was to Massey? I'm just curious.
How it
Came from Singapore to here.
How did Massey get it? I mean, I think it's wonderful that we've got it. I'm just curious as to how.
So because, it seemed that Oceania is a broader context for the same kinds of questions. That's really sort of the overarching motive for CARE to move from Singapore to New Zealand,
Building relationships, sometimes when you do community-based research, the funding might just be for 2 years, and then you have to do everything within those 2 years. And it is a neoliberal structure that you're operating within. But how do you build relationships if you only have a 2-year funding period, for example? And you can't just walk into a community and say, "Hi, I'm Franca from Massey. Give me all your knowledge, so that I can publish." And that's what we're expected to do.
Yes.
But how do you then, why should they even trust people from Massey or from any university, So that's never taken into account, that actually building relationships is a long-term process. How do we get that into the funding, that we need extra time for that? I mean, it's not a question, it's just a generic sort of statement that's one of the problems with the structures.
You are really just stating the truth of one of the many challenges that we face wherever we are in this divide, or where we're situated.
And if it
the
is
whole
supposed,
funding.
and if it is supposed to be a partnership, a relationship building thing, with not equal power, but with equal power, then how do you sort of it's quite difficult.
So Franco, in that sense, I think that's why one of the points we think about in the work of CARE is to sort of critiquing or interrogating funding.
Yeah, sure.
So that some of our oldest projects are about, I was sharing with Sue, are about 20 years old,
Wow.
where the funding has died,
Yeah.
but the work continues.
Yeah.
So I think that's the work of commitment, in
That's
a
right,
sense that
absolutely,
you carry out the work irrespective of the funding, but also recognize that there are going to be ebbs and flows in the funding in that sense. Which also brings an interesting question in terms of with funding, when you get so desperate, whom are you going to go to? So, at CARE, we have World Bank wanting to engage us, we never go to World Bank, So I think you sort of also mark your lines on the sand in terms of where you would go to and where you wouldn't.
Can I also add, from a community perspective, community organisations, while they are underfunded, know how to run on the smell of an oily rag. And they will say yes, we'll welcome, as long as we get something from that too.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can use the information to provide that information to our own funders, then that, from our perspective, is a win-win situation. So we're working together collaboratively, so that the information, as Sue said, doesn't just get put into a database somewhere, and that's it. We don't hear anything about it. That actually that information is useful to the organisation or the group, the community that you're working with.
You mentioned tainted money. How easy is it to actually find money that is not tied to any, that is truly untainted in your view, and that there aren't any real strings attached? Even, MFAT funding and this funding and that funding, there's always another part to it.
What a great question, So from a community organisation standpoint, how do you?
The groups we have worked with and still work with grapple with this all the time. There are actually very few places left in Aotearoa where groups like the group I work for at the moment can get money. We still take money from community organisation grant scheme, COGS, which is local distribution, community driven. It's an old model that we actually had an influence way back politically fighting for, so that groups themselves are involved in the funding distribution. It's only very small money, but we don't see that as tainted in more the process. Lottery community, foundation, or some philanthropic foundations that are at least open to funding community development or places, but there's not a lot. At least I don't know in this local area. There's not a lot up north. But then on the research side, where do you go for research funding if you're a community-based organisation? Very difficult if you don't have, and that's where probably collaborations with academic units, whether it's a department or a professor or a unit like CARE, that can be incredibly valuable for groups like ours, because the backing of the institution helps in all sorts of ways. So there's openings and possibilities that come from effective collaboration that wouldn't normally be open to community groups here.
And organisations have to have their own ethical discussions as well. Some organisations, for example, won't take money from Lion Foundation or lotteries because it's based on gambling, and so some organisations have specifically chosen to not take money from them, whereas other organisations might have an ethical discussion and come to the conclusion that for them that is fine. So that's also a
something else I was just going to add. Can I quickly add? Yeah. I was just going to add that for us we often go to our community partners to think through what would be acceptable funding. So I bring up the World Bank example because often, bank funds the kinds of projects we do in community-based work, but often that work is highly ideological in sort of gutting communities of sort of access to structural transformation and highly individualizing behavioral responses. So the poverty work of the bank would say, How can you promote the poor to save better? Can you develop, so we won't take that kind of funding because that goes ideologically against sort of the principles, you know.
Yeah, okay, so thank you very much. It's a breath of fresh air, it's fantastic. Because normally I come to academic stuff and I'm bored, and it's normally just this post-structuralist rubbish spoken, which doesn't really say anything in my opinion. I'm from an activist background, so I've got an activist and academic question. My first one's the activist one. And I think the biggest challenge we face here in Aotearoa at the moment is the real decline of social movements, activism. Because I think to have struggles from the oppressed, you really need that out on the streets, organising, workplaces, community. And I'd really like to ask Sue about what the hell happened to the anti-TPPA movement when you had this explosion when you're about over 2 years, mobilisation of 30,000 or more around the country, as big as the anti-Vietnam War, huge movement in Auckland early 2016. Labour Party comes in, so free trade is all connected to this horrible neoliberal globalisation and also a new form of colonisation by multinational, transnational corporations, it's tied into this. And in this country, this sort of died. Labour Party got in power and then they signed it. And there was not a peep of protest that I heard. So what do we do in this environment where we've had, we need to reinvigorate. How do we reinvigorate struggle? And the second question is about academia. Sorry, this is a huge question, but it's what I want to ask out today. But the environment wasn't very nice on Tuesday. I thought it was very academic focused. But it's about academia. So I've just become employed as an academic. I find it incredibly hard to do anything at all because I'm under this threat of publish or perish, I have to publish all the time because I'm starting out. I don't have any time to actually engage with anybody else I want to engage with. I have to spend all my weekends just writing stuff because I need to, get my foot on this horrible neoliberal ladder of mana or something that this weird space time. So how do you deal with that type of huge pressure when you actually want to change, help people in some way? And your suggestions are fantastic,
These are huge questions, which I'm deeply interested in and spend a lot of my life working on, or particularly the first question, but really conscious of the second one. Even from my 1 year in academia, I learned about PBRF. It took me a year to even get into the PBRF structure, by which time I was leaving, before I even got properly in. Anyway, it's just incredible. So you have my sympathies. And but in terms of activism, I work for an organisation that you heard about the other day called Tari, and we run workshops around these kind of things, including the Neoliberal Academy actually. But like what all the time, what is the edge? Why does this happen? What can we do to strengthen activism or grassroots organisation again, or unions again? Because you're absolutely right, and we're very conscious of it. And I'm so old now, I've seen wave after wave of Labour-led governments coming in this country. Every time a Labour or Labour-led government comes in, well, almost every time, not always, but mostly, there's this huge sinking of whatever strength there is in movements, coalitions, alliances and grassroots struggle, it just hugely weakens it. And the TPP was just, because I was in that mass mobilisation in February, it was amazing what happened. But then everything, like you say, everything died. But yeah, it's just, okay, Labour's in power, we're right, everything's nice now. It's that psychology, And also we have to be nice because they're our friends, and so we can't protest anymore. And we will just lobby our local MP, Mr Galloway, or Les Galloway, or whoever it is, and we'll be right. And so that's psychology over and over again.
I will sort of briefly share my response into my half-baked thoughts. And when I say that I have to use a huge caveat, I say this as a Dean's Chair Professor of Communications. So I have ticked all the boxes and played all the games of academia to get where I am. So I'm very aware of that. Having said that, I think the work of academia then is to bring activism into academia in terms of thinking through how we measure, how we evaluate, how we measure, what does impact mean, what does actually academic work, academic labor mean, and constantly activating on that to transform it. So, in my limited capacity, I write op-eds, write blog posts, write to administrators about metrics, and I just wrote a piece, I think Stevie read it, right, about metricide, or death by metrics, you know. So I think we have to constantly sort of try to challenge that. But I think a lot of that responsibility, again, in terms of power sharing, is about senior academics and those, unfortunately, who are embedded in that structure by gaming the system, who have to start doing it in some ways. And the other thing I also think is that there is a vital role for trade unions to take up questions about academic labor and what does it mean to evaluate academic labor.
One of the things I noticed in just moving on from your question there is I've had a number of friends who are activists and then move into academia, and there seems to be an interesting thing that happens when they sign a contract, a university contract, or in fact any government contract at all, because there's all these wonderful little caveats that come with signing these contracts. So I wonder, how do you change that part of your, you know, the neoliberal sort of system of having to, of being, what's the word, being silenced, you know, through this contractual obligation. But on that, what makes some people suddenly go silent, and then others, and I will use the example Dr. Mike Joy, will still, understanding that there are certain things that he hasn't been funded for because of his stance, he still stands and publishes, and so he's still a voice out there for the environment. So what makes him different to so many former activists who are now in academia and are suddenly silenced because of a contractual obligation?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think of Jane Kelsey too, up in Auckland.
Yeah.
On the GPP and International Global Finance and its control. There are people who are exceptional. But I think we need to be, people who are in academia, just need to keep looking at themselves and thinking, people like me need to keep challenging, others of us need to keep challenging academics.
Or do we want to challenge that system of, you know, where government is saying you can't speak against?
Yeah. But the ones that will stand up for the role of critic and conscience, and there are, I think, in every single university around this country, there are whole heaps of, I think there are far more academics who want to stand up and who want to challenge it from inside and outside. That was my experience in trying to build that think tank, was that, like I say, there were over 800 people that were in contact with, many of hundreds of them were in the academy. Probably the majority were from the academy. And so I just saw this tremendous wish for release and for opportunities, and they saw a left think tank as one place that might say, like the edge of safety, where they could perhaps publish a paper or work on some project where it would be safe enough for them to have input and do work for unions or community or other places, but without putting their jobs in jeopardy. Like, people are looking for those spaces. And sometimes people only can do the sort of thing that David, I don't know if you know David Williams and his work on the treaty from a Pākehā point of view, with Māori or Jane and Mike is fantastic. Those sort of people where I think a lot of their courage and ability to stand like that is because they've already built their academic reputation so strongly that no vice chancellor, no senate, no council dare sack them. So they've built their cred to such an extent, and there'd be other examples around the place. But most academics aren't actually in that position. And are under real threat. Like, people like where we've crossed, we don't totally understand it. But that's why I also feel a duty to support academics in saying, yes, you can be braver, you can, but actually if you come into our workshops with us so that we work together, so you can see where we can share and learn and grow and cross the lines, you know, there's places, and I'm sure Kira's going to play that role too. There are places where we do cross the lines and try and, I was at a workshop on this from our group up at Wellsford last weekend on this very topic. Half the people in the room were academics, how we were doing role plays and skits about what happens. It's quite funny. I wish you could see the little plays. How you stand up for each other in front of the university. Because up in Auckland there's been this huge fight over the libraries, closing the 3 fine arts, architecture and music libraries, just closing them. And so the students and staff have been fighting back, so we were kind of role-playing what happened there and why they lost. Yeah. But people were standing up. So, yeah, it's on us, all of us. We're going off time here.
Do we have one last question and then we can wrap up?
Do you find social media and that whole new way of communication has changed the actual physical presence of people going out on the streets? They're sort of more doing it through the media rather than physically getting out there and actually showing the human being out there.
To some extent, but I think over the years people have more and more understood the importance of actually being in physical solidarity in action, as well as being on Facebook and Twitter and everywhere else. I think there's quite wide understanding. It's a bit of a kind of cliche now, so anyone that really is serious about action knows they actually have to get out. But I still have a bit of a thing about online petitions and that, like as being the solution to poverty. It actually has to go way past the internet.
Great, we will wrap up with that. I want to take a minute to thank you, Sue, for your incredible work with us, for spending your time with CARE and with Massey for this whole week. And it's been an amazing journey for us. So thank you.
For me too. Thanks for having me. Thank you.